Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this on this really wonderful panel of esteemed guests and very accomplished thinkers and writers, and I'm very excited for this conversation. So I'll just introduce people in the order that they're sitting to my left, and then we'll engage in some conversation on this very cheerful topic to finish off this lovely day of the relationship between politics and violence. So immediately to my left, Pedro Silva has had a very storied career that expands from the United States Air Force, where he served as a satellite communications technician before cross-training to become a Chinese linguist, all the way to professional ministry, serving with the progressive Christian denomination, the United Church of Christ. He has also served in a myriad of other capacities, from corporate recruiter to AmeriCorps Vista. And at the heart of every choice he has made, whether vocationally or educationally, is a deep desire to unite people. It was this same desire that led him to spend the last 8 years supporting the Bridging Movement, a national effort to bring humans together across a variety of differences. This work began with Pedro volunteering as a faith partner with Living Room Conversations, and ultimately joining the team at Unify in February 2022. In addition to these roles, Pedro is on the board of Modus Theater, an advisor for CU Center for the Humanities and Arts, hosts 2 podcasts, one on comedy and the other on embodied spirituality, and writes consistently on a variety of human-centered subjects. I don't know where you find the time, using poetry and prose. His newsletter, People Are Not Things, is available on LinkedIn. Additionally, Pedro launched the Liberation Comedy Project and can be found doing stand-up locally. Earlier this year, Pedro was presented with the YWCA of Boulder County's Community Impact Award, a distinction he shares with Katarina Dawn Miller, one of the directors of the award-winning documentary, This Is Not Who We Are. Finally, Pedro has recently relaunched Higher Up Consulting, an umbrella venture that enables Pedro to bring his skills in public speaking, writing, coaching, and creating custom trainings under one moniker. So please welcome Pedro to the panel here. And then to Pedro's left, Professor Reiland Rabaka is is professor of African American and Caribbean Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies, and the founder and director of the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is also a research fellow in the College of Human Sciences at the University of South Africa. Dr. Rabaka has published 19 books and more than 100 scholarly articles. I don't know where you find the time for all these things either. Book chapters and essays. He has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian Institution, the Eugene M. Caden Book Award, and the National Council for Black Studies Distinguished Career Award. He has conducted archival research and lectured extensively, both nationally and internationally, and he has been the recipient of several community service citations, distinguished teaching awards, and research fellowships. His cultural criticism, social commentary, and political analysis has been featured in print, radio, television, and online media ventures such as NPR, PBS, BBC, all the acronyms, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, MTV, BET, VH1, the New York Times, the Associated Press, and The Guardian, among others. And he is also, as if a side note, a poet and a musician. So please, thank you. Welcome, Reiland. Next is Ruchira Gupta. An Emmy Award-winning journalist, author, and social justice advocate with over 3 decades of experience in advancing women's rights, child rights, and gender justice. Founder of Apne Op, hope I got that somewhat correct. She has rescued thousands from sex trafficking. She has worked with the UN in Iran, Kosovo, Thailand, Nepal, and New York, contributing to global anti-trafficking protocols and survivor funds. A recipient of the French Legion of Honor, Ruchira is professor of practice at NYU, sits on several international boards, and has co-authored a book with Gloria Steinem and written a best-selling novel for young adults, I Kick and I Fly. I'm sure that's available downstairs. Her career began as a journalist where she experienced violence firsthand while covering the demolition of a mosque in North India, leading to backlash when testifying to Parliament and other inquiries. She went on to make documentaries for the BBC on the rise of authoritarianism in India and has been writing on this for 3 decades in major publications. So please welcome Ruchira to the stage. And to Ruchira's left is Anne Waldman, Poet, professor, performer, librettist, and cultural activist Anne Waldman is the author of over 60 volumes of poetry, poetics, and anthologies, including the Iovis trilogy, Colors in the Mechanism of Concealment from Coffee House Press, which won the Penn Center Literary Prize. Penguin has published her books over many years, including Trickster Feminism, among 5 others. Her new book from Penguin, Mesopotopia, will be published in 2025. And her album, Skiamaki, was released in 2020 by Fast Speaking Music and has been described by none less than Patti Smith as exquisitely potent, a psychic shield for our times. We could all use some of that. She was arrested at Rocky Flats with Daniel Ellsberg and Allen Ginsberg in the 1970s, reading poems that challenged deliveries of plutonium for the manufacturing of pits for nuclear warheads. She was part of protests during the Vietnam War and the Chicago 7 trial, and she has participated in current doings of countercultural and political intervention in subsequent times, such as Occupy Wall Street. Waldman co-founded the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics program at Naropa University, and the 50th anniversary summer writing program for that program is coming up in June 2025. Waldman was the keynote speaker for the Bob Dylan and Beats Conference in Tulsa in the spring of 2022. And she wrote the libretto for the critically acclaimed Grammy-nominated 2024 opera Black Lodge with music by composer David T. Little that premiered at Opera Philadelphia. Publishers Weekly has called Anne Waldman a countercultural giant, and looking at the range and depth of her contributions across a variety of media, it is easy to see why. So please welcome Anne to the stage. And honestly, we could have gone over for an hour just talking about the accomplishments of these 4 people to my left, so I'm, again, very grateful to be here. And this is a challenging topic, and there's so many different ways that we can approach it. So what I wanted to do at the outset is just invite you to reflect upon this topic of the relationship between politics and violence. What would you bring to the frame for an informed discussion about this? What events, what trends, what processes, what ideas do you think that we need to have an informed and ideally nonviolent conversation about this? Big question, big silence, yes.
Okay, I'll start first then, because just so that we can move on. I come from India, which is the land of Gandhi, where nonviolence has been used very effectively in politics and successfully. So it is very strange for me to experience the use of violence in politics in the last 3 decades, from the time that I experienced violence while covering the demolition of a mosque in North India. And that day, I saw the blatant use of political power to incite violence and hatred in very sexual language. As the mosque was coming down, leader after leader on the terrace was saying, give it one more push, recover your masculinity, and are you wearing bangles? And historically you have been oppressed by people who've invaded us from Central Asia, Muslims, so take it back, we will build a temple here. And that day I saw that it could happen, that people did respond to this. They did bring down the mosque, and then later in cities all across India, they went on a rampage attacking poor Muslims living in shanties and shacks. And for myself too, I experienced that there was nothing there to protect me. There was a political party in action, there was a woman who was attacked. I wasn't raped, I wasn't murdered, but I was definitely attacked almost to the point that I lost my life. And I came back to Delhi and decided to testify in various commissions of inquiry about what had happened to me. In the press council, in tribunals, in a Liberhans, a parliamentary commission of inquiry. And I found to my horror that, again, I was facing something which was very toxic. And, we now use the word toxic masculinity. That time I didn't even have the vocabulary. I didn't even know what gaslighting was. I didn't know what trivializing of testimony or marginalization was. I didn't know the vocabulary. But there I was standing in court, and I was asked questions like, where are your scratch marks? Do you smoke cigarettes? Is there a photograph of any god in your family, in your home? Why do you have so many male friends? You're a girl from a good family, and you say that your shirt buttons had come off. So I said that I'd gone to the big leader at that time and told him to stop the violence. And he said, it's a historic day, get out of the way and celebrate. And so how could you go in front of such a big leader in such a disheveled state? But even then, I knew enough to say that the shame was not mine, it was his. And that moment radicalized me in a way to start looking at the use of violence. And since then, I have seen how my country, India, is being groomed almost into thinking of violence as the norm because violence has proved to be successful. First, with the Babri Masjid, and secondly, later with the Godhra riots, which many of you may have read about in Gujarat. Each thing led to more power. And so, everyone began to think, okay, let's use violence. It's very easy. And, we began to have mob lynchings. People got away with that. We began to have extrajudicial killings. People began to get away with that, and rapes. Gang rapes from, rape became like a group activity. Today in India, we have rapes of every 16 minutes. Every 16 minutes, a woman is raped. And not just raped, it's now accompanied by murder. And even the go-to solution, because society has become so groomed into violence, that even the go-to solution is not like looking at structural reform or, anything. It's death penalty. And nothing is solved, and we carry on, and we've become more and more bloodthirsty. So politics and violence is so interconnected and I see the same thing, deja vu, when I came to America, and I saw 6th January, and I thought, I can't believe this is happening all over again.
So, do you want to go?
Okay.
All right.
I'll go next.
So, what comes to mind for me, and when I studied to be a linguist, it reframed the way I saw the entire world, because I started to see everything as language. And it occurred to me that the first two languages of humanity are sex and violence. One is to bring us together, the other is to tear us apart. And then the language that's emerged, the words that we use that emerged, were not emergent to describe truth or what is, but rather to deceive. So that, say, a person's smaller and they're vulnerable to violence, they can say, look, a tiger. And then the person goes, oh, and then they can just run away. So language at its earliest form is more of a deceptive enterprise. And then as we became more conscious, we started trying to wrestle with language to make it describe what words can never describe. And that's where the spiritual things occurred in our minds. And that's why I kind of hold spirituality really high in my heart. But I hold art even higher because it's a way to bring what cannot be put into words into the realm of communication. And so that's what authors do, that's what painters do, that's what all the artists do. They wrestle with what cannot be spoken and then bring it into the world and help the world conform more to a higher ideal. And so that's what I think about. And when I think about politics, I think of it also as an act of creation that is kind of bound by its original state of violence and sexuality and deception. And it goes back to our basis forms of how we are. That's why it's important for us to continue to speak our voices into every situation that we find ourselves in, whether that voice is spoken or whether it's painted or whether it's danced or whatever way that we can bring the invisible into the visible. And I'll kind of wrap it up with this notion. It's like a half-baked idea, but it's something that I'm writing right now. And the title is Democracy or Anarchy, There's No Other Choice. And what I posit is that what we call democracy, an idea of everyone having a voice and contributing to the governance of the world, is the ideal of humanity. And that even a person who might want to be a despot or be a dictator, it's actually impossible because they always have to confer with someone else. They always have to be in communication with someone else, whether it's investors or whatever the case may be. So you might have a voiceless democracy where less and less people speak, or a voiceful democracy. And I think that what makes us have the capacity to live into this highest ideal is when more of us use our voices. A lot of us have not used our voices. We give our voices over to other people and we trust them to speak for us, but we need to learn how to speak for ourselves. We need to learn how to live from the deepest depths of our embodied experiences, and however we can get it out, put it out there. Painting, dancing, screaming, whatever it is, get it out. Because then we will have a world that really reflects all of us. Because the fact is, all of us are here, and all of us have a say, but if we don't take that opportunity, we get what we get.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'd like to talk about cognitive dissonance for a moment, since I feel we are all living this in the daily things that we're hearing, all the memes. I was so impressed hearing Ilhan Omar, our congresswoman, from Muslim background, congresswoman, so articulate on the idea of memeing into reality. This memeing into reality, which is just overwhelming the discourse and can block things, and and we're sitting there, I feel like my ears are just exploding all the time. And as we all work with language, this notion of for me always with Alan and others when we were founding the Kerouac School and so on, was what is the role of poetry to help wake the world up to itself? And so that idea of being a kind of mirror and reflection, and I think for those of us who study in spiritual traditions and so on, you see that mirror all the time. That's what you're looking for in that crystal ball. What is reflected back at you? So cognitive dissonance. My father coming back from World War II, somewhat, I would say PTSD, which wasn't described then, and then going to public school. I grew up in the Greenwich Village. My mother had lived a decade in Greece around an incredibly inspiring Delphic communal utopia around the poet Angelos Siklianos, and they were bringing Greek drama back to these places and connecting with people like Orozco in Mexico and various spiritual teachers, as well as other Greek poets and performers and so on, and inspired by Isadora Duncan's work. But in any case, so parents who were somewhat, had been out in the world, my father, a little deafened, I would see the little amulets from his time in the war, but he came back wounded, saw some things. But then in going to school, with the dog tag, which some of you might remember, and of course, bodies still carry that kind of information along. I mean, I'm told there are 2 dog tags now, one that goes with a dead body and one is a kind of memento. But in any case, clutching your dog tag under your desk in the 50s, because there's fire drills and the commies are coming, and we've already had the nuclear bomb. And so the bomb, for many of my generation, was this defining moment, which I think turned us towards art and poetry and creativity. It was so preposterous, so challenging an idea that the world could end, that you could blow up, kill people, and I had friends who lost family in the Holocaust, and this is just echoing now with the situation in Palestine and so on. Just these unresolved things since that war and the many wars, and of course what I was growing up with Vietnam and how one related to those kinds of scenarios. But in any case, that idea of this is not, how can this be real? It's too outrageous, it's too precarious. So this has carried with me, I think, everything I've gotten involved with in terms of resistance and protest has that quality. And we invoke, negative capability from John Keats, being able to hold disparate ideas in the mind without any reach after fact or reason, which helps with, understanding sort of dualities and entwinement, entanglement. And there's so many mysteries out there. I mean, lately I'm really excited about antimatter, just trying to understand that, the spooky attraction at a distance, what they're doing with the neutrinos, following the neutrinos, whether I should hate or embrace AI. A little on the, I just don't, it's just a war, another thing that'll be used by the war machine, so on and on. So these things come up, and I really advocate for students and younger people I work with, study, 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 go be studying, something Fred Moten is always, talking about. We have to do that. In this book, new book, Mesopotamia, I tried to go back to Mesopotamia. In fact, the poet Ann Carson said, "What's the title of your book? Mesopotamia?" I said, "No, Mesopotopia." She said, "That sounds like my kitchen sink." So I always have, I'm trying to go back into this ancient civilization and see what the Sumerians were doing in their warlike poetry and their, visionary operations, and then carry it through, through time in these different layers. I'm constantly jumping around between past, present, future. So it's a meditative another one of these long sort of epic pieces that's in parts. And I find that's the form I'm most comfortable with, because it has to be a sort of meditation, a kind of study, not necessarily coming to any, final point. But I just feel blessed to have the, inspiration, which I, take back to that cognitive dissonance, to keep going. It's the koan, it's the, way you're trying to unveil for yourself in the mirror. And the other long epic, Colors in the Mechanism of Concealment, is the subtitle. So that sense of, all these things are concealed. We can go down so many rabbit holes, as people are doing constantly all the time, very distracting, very problematic in some ways, but also useful to churn up that, questioning mind. And at Jaipur Sanjoy will remember in 2016, there was a final panel on truth and false news. And I thought, I'll do this Buddhist thing, talk about relative truth and absolute truth, and we're somewhere in between, and trying to take it out of the conundrum always of this precipice of where we are at mentally. I think this is a time when you can just go mad with the, memeing of reality, and it's being most conventions, and I was very pleased. I felt there could have been more about the wars brought into the Democratic Convention, but also feeling that the optimism, the joyousness of change, and trying to really make things better. We're also working within this ongoing capitalist system, and how could we ever start? What about the start over or so on? I have to deal with these. We're supposed to be talking to our neighbors, dealing with all the anarchist friends, and saying, "You got to vote." I'm an anarchist. I'm very impatient about that now. And Amiri Baraka, we were talking about, I want to invoke him. He was a guest often at Naropa, and he brought this kind of, out on the street, doing the work, energy. And I remember when he talked very favorably about Obama, and Obama had been on somewhere, maybe at the Capitol, and Amiri was on the steps, and Obama went over to him and said, "Amiri Baraka, the poet?" and put his hand out. And so Amiri thought, okay, well, I'll give him a chance. He recognized me as a poet. But anyway, I was going back to these conventions of, trying to see if they ever say the word poetry. I remember once Hillary Clinton said something like, "Well, it's more like poetry than prose." I thought, something's maybe cooking here. But I didn't hear poetry. There were some wonderful performances. Yeah. In any case, sorry. Wow. Thank you.
Here we go. I'm so full hearing y'all. I'm going to try to keep this brief. I'm so overwhelmed with all the talk of political violence and politics and violence, so I'm going to out myself. I'm a radical pacifist. And so I think that it's important, if we talk about political violence, at least dealing with the students I'm dealing with, 18 to 25 years old, it's important to offer some alternatives. So if there's nothing else that you get from what I'm about to say, and please know that at the end, for me, it's about creating a world where all of us are included and no one is excluded. So it's a world predicated on radical inclusivity, because, if people are running around Boulder, Colorado talking about DEI and Boulder looks the way it looks when we don't have JLF here, then we obviously need to do more, and we could do more, right? And I'm saying this as a citizen of Boulder County, so this is my hometown right now as well. So this is an act of love. Oh, can y'all feel that? Yeah, that's what love sounds like. For me, it's important for us to define politics and to define violence. Again, I'm not going to keep you here all night. We would be here until forevermore. I'm an Afrofuturist, so we would be here till long in the future. However, I just want to sort of isolate violence. There are a lot of different kinds of violence. And so when I talk about violence, I'm thinking about someone like Hannah Arendt. I'm thinking about Frantz Fanon. I'm thinking about Albert Memmi. I'm thinking about violence isn't purely physical. Violence can also be psychological. It can be emotional. It can be environmental. I'm a musician, so I also know that violence can be lyrical. There's a lot of violence against queer folk, trans folk, girls, women in the music now, right? So a lot of these different things are gendered in some different kinds of way. I find a lot of the music also incredibly heteronormative, if not straight up heterosexist. Maybe they can't hear me. Ann, are they with me? Pedro, are they with me? Right? And so calling into question sort of what violence is, because I think in a very sort of phallocentric patriarchal society, most people are only going to isolate physical violence, not understanding that violence can also be verbal, psychological, emotional, and so on and so forth. That's why, I so appreciate, I really, really do. Thank you so much. It was very powerful what you shared, right? And so the various levels of violence, and so whatever privilege I have, if I show up as a man, it's very important to embrace male feminism, male womanism, to be like Adrienne Rich, talk about poetry, to disavow male privilege, to actually sort of go against the very undergirding of it, and to acknowledge that we've sort of been socialized to be little patriarchal pigs, right? To challenge that and to sort of plot out a new direction. So in my classrooms and in my work, I'm attempting to offer alternatives, right? I'm attempting to take us in a different direction. I have found, I'm pretty sure you all have as well, the classroom is a very different place post-COVID. Are we really post-COVID? But anyway, the classroom is a different place now. And I think if we talk only about sometimes what is wrong without offering up some directions as to sort of where we can go and make these things right, we're going to have greater mass depression, right? The kind of negativity that I think that many of us are creating art to get away from, right? I do think that there's a place in this society for high levels of idealism, of utopianism. And I'm going to end, David. Don't worry, I'm going to close out.
Good, please.
I'm going to end. No, it's okay. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm going to end with one of my musical idols. His name is John Lennon. And Mr. Lennon wrote this song where he says, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope one day y'all will join us and the world can live as one. Wow, imagine. So for me, I would say an alternative to the political violence would be radical imagination, would be radical inclusivity, would be more insurgent forms of intersectionality where we stop acting like folks only have one identity. And, go back to what Audre Lorde was saying long ago, the Combahee River Collective, when they were talking about identity politics and the way various aspects of our identity are always intersecting, interlocking, overlapping. Thank y'all. Peace.
Read that book, The Combahee Collective. Very important book.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I wanted to continue with this theme about imagination. So I was reading this book by a political scientist, Barbara Walter, who says that violence stems from a lack of imagination or a poverty of imagination. So given the context that we're here today, men and women of letters here, I mean, what do you see as the relationship between the imagination and alternatives to violence? If a lack of imagination is the source of violence in many respects, then what are the positive creative roles that imagination can play, and what forms can that take? And some of you touched on this already, but another opportunity to kind of elaborate on your thinking here.
Elevated consciousness is very important, I think, in how that, you can can be so tentacular, your mind, when you let it, connecting the dot, different schemes of what you're doing today. Are you going to connect those dots? Are you going to be more collagiste or surreal, let things fall where they are? But that kind of never knowing exactly where it's going, and then also imagining, as you say, into the future. And I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to, be with children more and seeing the incredible need and this talk of, shutting down education and the library book bans and all that. This is a level, I think all of us, because we live in communities that have libraries and schools and children all over the place, and that's an important thing to take on if you can't handle, traveling huge distances or, there's problems in interfering with your work life, et cetera, family life. But those are such essential things because a child's imagination is already so rich as they're born, and it's losing it that, is the issue. And so the way the corruption of, as I was saying before, just the language, I feel like we have to protect it and go to our, studies, go and play with your dictionary and, get some new words and get out that, etymology dictionary. That's essential for poets to always have that kind of thing where you can look at the sources of words and you travel all over the world to these different places and the words open new worlds, et cetera. So there's so much you can do just on your own, very simply. Books are reasonable still.
I would say acknowledging that there are high levels of colonization that are still going on in our society.
Yeah.
I think that America needs to tell itself the truth. It started out as 13 colonies, right? And so there's a colonialism kind of hardwired into it. And so what we have oftentimes is a colonization of our imagination, right? Art is free, should be, and open. Right? And so for me, as a kid who grew up in the public housing projects, when I got exposed to all those sort of art after-school programs, it just opened up a whole nother way to sort of reimagine my surroundings. And so for me, I would say there's this incredible connection between imagination and dreams. My grandmother, who's 97 years old, my grandmother's grandmother experienced Juneteenth, right? African Americans have only been free about 158 years. And so my grandmother often tells me about Jubilee, about Freedom Day. And so freedom is something very real and very tangible. It's not some kind of ethereal ideal. And so when we start talking about democracy in the United States of America, I'm just pausing. Just letting that marinate for a moment. The reality is that a truly open democratic society should be an incredibly inclusive society, right? A society that promotes difference, that celebrates human diversity at all different levels, right? And so that connection between imagination and dreams, but for me, I think art is the glue that allows me to really actualize. I like it so much, and when you were talking about this higher consciousness, because I think that a lot of the folks that taught me, part of that 60s, 70s generation, they taught me a great deal about consciousness raising sessions where, today a lot of people it's all about the party, and they really do mean partying. But for back in the day, consciousness raising would happen in a lot of different ways, right, all over, and carrying some of that energy forward, leaving in the past what should be left in the past, but also understanding how do we sift through and salvage, do a kind of archaeology, as Michel Foucault might say, do an archaeology where we carry some things forward, the positive things forward, and to build on them so that we can have a future, a liberated future.
And, just to add to what both of them have said, I often think that, especially as a woman, what we experience is being groomed also into obedience, and obedience is the foundation of the hierarchies which then become more and more vicious and turn into violence if we oppose it. So what we are facing really right now in politics is a backlash moment. Because as women, we have more rights, and we have the vote, we have property, we can say domestic violence is a crime, and we are trying to break the glass ceiling now in terms of even wages and work and all of that. So we are facing a backlash, obviously, because we are either cheap labor or we produce cheap labor. And it's at home, because that's where we first learn that it's all right for hierarchy to be okay, for one class of human beings to order and one to obey, and one to get approval for their work and one to seek approval, one to get paid, one not to get paid. And gender digs a trench into our brain. When we step out into the world, we accept all other hierarchies. We think hierarchy is normal, so race or class or sexuality, religion, ethnicity. So there are many hierarchies. And then we begin to long for someone who will sort this out. There's a simmering discontent. And who can sort that out? The head of the family, the strong man, the authoritarian leader. And we replicate this again and again to the point that now we are actually on the verge of fascism, which would love to use this idea of order and obey, because that's what it rests on. And we have lost the imagination to know, because we were groomed into not imagining anything else as the structure of power, even though we have successful examples. And again, I'll talk about Gandhi, because India won independence from the British without a single shot being fired. And Gandhi did try to attempt to decentralize power, right down to the village unit. His famous book is, of course, The India of My Dreams. It's a pamphlet, not theoretically very sound, maybe, but it led to a movement which ended colonialism for us. And then there was The Village of My Dreams, which we never implemented, and possibly that's the problem that we are facing now. What you were talking about, that now we are seeing hierarchies everywhere. And so democracy has begun to seem like hypocrisy to a lot of young people. And the only way forward now is to see it, acknowledge the truth of it, and recapture that, because our bodies are at stake now, literally.
So I want to thank all of you, because I can feel all of you, what you're saying, getting into my body and then wanting to come out in a certain way. And I think that that's what we need to learn how to do, is we need to allow other people's ways of being in the world come into our bodies and inform us. One of the things that I've said to people is, if you go into a conversation if you come out of the conversation the same way you went into it, then you were not participating. That you were relying on your defense mechanisms to keep you from changing. But the reality is that you're gonna change whether you want to or not. I don't think there's anybody in here that is still a baby, at least physically. So I'm going to speak to that question about imagination through the lens of some children that I've worked with over the years, starting with working with children in the church when I was a pastor. And I had several kids that would say to me during the confirmation, I don't believe in God, and I don't believe in spirituality. And I would say, awesome. And then they would be like, what? Like, why would you say awesome? Like, you're a pastor, you shouldn't say that. And I'm like, hey, man, I'm fine with it. You know what I mean? And what I would say to them is, this is how I define spirituality: infinite imaginative capacity. So spirituality, just infinite imaginative capacity. And some of us have a restricted imaginative capacity. We've been told that there's a certain outcome that we have to go toward. So get that job, get that career, do this thing, and get the outcome, and get the gold, or whatever it is that you're supposed to be getting. And so we limit our imagination to this kind of like, I know I think it was the Greeks that had this idea of the daimon. And we have this one, and it is like, in America anyway, it's a white guy, and everyone kind of conforms their imagination to that. And even if they are the furthest thing they can be from a middle-aged white guy that's a multimillionaire or billionaire, there's some restrictive mechanism in place that tells them that they're not enough. And coming from the Christian church, I could say that I grew up in a black church with a white Jesus, blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus at the front of the room.
Tell the truth.
And one day I got kicked out of my black church for questioning white Jesus. Because I was like, hey, if we think that is the penultimate person, and we know there's no way we're going to ever experience that in this body, doesn't it seem that means that that's the gatekeeper of our spirituality? And what I've found, and I'm theorizing, is that a lot of these people, I'm going to tell you a little funny story, and I'll try to wrap it up real quick. I have a buddy of the Latino persuasion that is super Trumpy. And he was trying to convince me of that Trump was Jesus Jr. And I was like, Bro, I'm gonna listen to you. I'm gonna walk down this path with you, but I really don't understand this. And my friend, and I have black friends also, who support Trump. It was just that's their prerogative, right? But what they all said was, I don't consider it's my brother. I don't want to say it's my brother, but it's my brother. It already started slipping out. But my brother said, I don't consider myself black anymore. My Latino friend said, I don't consider myself Mexican anymore. And they were all trying to go through this gateway of whiteness to get to this other realm. And they can't see themselves as human until they can see themselves as close as white as possible. And I think some of them see that red hat as a camouflage of their color. And they disappear when they put that hat on. And they become nothing. And nothing is better than what they experience themselves as on the inside. So their imaginative capacity is limited. The second group of kids I'll tell you about is I worked with refugees when I was in AmeriCorps from different parts of Africa and Kosovo. And they were trying to teach these kids English, and they were having a hard time. And they said, I don't know why they're having such a hard time. And I said, well, I'll redo the curriculum. Let me see, what are y'all doing to teach them English? And they were talking about George Washington, and I can't tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. I said, this is what y'all teaching them? That's a problem. They came to this country, and they're teaching them this kind of stuff, limiting their imaginative capacity. And so I invite all of you, as we were starting in the beginning, to tap into your imaginative capacity. Don't say stuff like, I'm not creative. And every time somebody tells me they're not creative, I say, have you ever farted before? And they're like, what? What do you mean? I say, well, something came in you and something came out of you that didn't exist before. So you're inherently creative. Just broaden your creative abilities. So I invite all of y'all to keep tapping into that. Take in your bodies, what you're hearing here. Don't let it just be our voices. This is us. This is us. So take it in and let it out in the most beautiful way possible.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up to questions in a few minutes here, but I wanted to sort of put to you a question about courage. So Hannah Arendt's been invoked here. Hannah Arendt says the primary political virtue is courage because all action is inherently unpredictable. Right? So when we engage in political action, we are fundamentally uncertain as to what the outcome of that is going to be. And courage is what enables us to face that uncertainty. But I also heard in what you were talking about, Pedro, the sort of courage it takes to engage in interpersonal conversation in a polarized political landscape and how that can be frightening and difficult. And all of you in your creative work, in your active work, activist work, have had to embody courage at many points. And I'm just sort of curious on a personal level how you've been able to tap into that, how you've been able to regenerate that in the face of difficulty, just some thoughts and reflections on courage, and then we'll be able to open it up to the audience.
Well, I think it's something you have experienced at some point, and then you realize what that is, the empowerment that can come with that. And I invoke this, part of a title, Colors and the Mechanism of Concealment. So this idea of almost of documentary poetics, investigative poetics, it takes courage to uncover things that might be very uncomfortable. So some of the practices and so on, even I was in Bhopal right after the terrible Union Carbide and at a poetry in India festival there, and there were photographs of the incredible deaths and suffering of children and everyone, mothers and so on, and there with a group of poets, and at this beautiful sort of museum over water, and the setting, the photos were so powerful, and you felt you had to come up to that, and then you felt the courage of the people continuing to fight, and they were working with all kinds of Roy and all kinds of people to bring the truth and go to Union Carbide and take them on. So I kind of got involved with that for a while. It's still not, we're still, as I said, we're figuring out the detritus of always with everything. It's never resolved, and then the karma, because we don't figure it out how to never do it again, it happens again, and so on. So just thinking of those ways to, in your own work, to keep, push on these things. I want to know more. I'm curious. I can handle the truth. I can move in that way. So and also going down to Texas. A friend here was with us when we went to the border near El Paso with the children in cages. I mean, we couldn't get into the buildings, but the story was they were just screaming. Your next book, okay, I can't wait for that. So important. Anyway, those kinds of things that you don't really know what's going on. You don't even hear the screaming, but it's there, that kind of thing.
So for me, when I decided to testify, I just did it because I had this deep conviction about the truth that I have to speak up. And the courage came later because I didn't understand the backlash fully. But then I became more courageous because I became more stubborn, that I will stick to my grounds. And then I found courage in community because I found other people who came and stood by me and who said that she's right and we believe her and all of that. So I built more and more friends and allies. And I think subconsciously, possibly the idea that I wanted to stick to the truth of the moment came from my family, because I came from a family of socialists, and my dad is a staunch Gandhian, still wears homespun till this day, and went to jail as a 15-year-old for India's independence. So, it was always about standing up for what is right, the truth, and satyagraha and all of that. So I somehow must have imbibed that idea of truth.
I'll keep this brief because I want to hear from the audience. For me, courage is inspired by the ancestors. I feel like my ancestors, they wouldn't have made it through the Middle Passage without a great deal of courage. And it makes me invoke Harriet Tubman in particular, who we consider the godmother of our people. And so the fact that when we start talking about African American history and culture, it begins on a womanist note. And it was Harriet Tubman and her legacy and what she did that inspired Frederick Douglass, right? So again, most people, they just skip over that and they act like one came, so it's very important to sort of have an accurate understanding. And when that happens, that ancestral connection, that ancestral wisdom is a great source of inspiration. I also consider music gives me a great deal of courage, believe it or not. I think some people are making some incredibly experimental music that is very courageous. I have a BFA in jazz studies, so the form of jazz I'm interested in is avant-garde jazz and what they used to call free jazz. So to really sort of push the envelope, we're not interested in the hyper-commercialization of this music. And then lastly, my poems are prayers. And so I get a lot of inspiration, a lot of courage from a prayer practice that is connected to my meditation practice. But all these things together, I think, help to give me more and more courage. And then they're just everyday random acts of kindness and compassion that inspire me. And that makes me sort of more courageous.
When I hear the word courage, I think of my dad when he was dying. And my uncle kept saying, "Fortish and kurasha," which is like, in my dad's language, is basically strength and courage. And that word courage is closely connected to the word for heart. And so I think that in order to have courage, you have to live from your heart. You have to be willing to let your heart break, knowing that it will heal again, but it will also be broken again, and it will also heal again. And so courage is trusting the process of living from your heart. And now I'm gonna say something that I don't mean in an offensive way, but I'm gonna say it. A lot of Western, mostly white people, live from here up, and they live in their head. And many of you, sorry to say, do not get to the place where it touches your heart or your body. Everybody else is embodied, because we look at their bodies and we make up stories about people's bodies, and people who are afraid of other people's bodies make up stories in their head to keep them safe. They use their imaginative capacity to see someone that's a threat instead of using it to see a possible friend. And so my invitation to you is to go closer to your heart. Bring your head and heart together, as Howard Thurman, who also studied under Gandhi, talked about. Bring your head and heart together, and you will have courage as a natural result. Courage is actually easy if you're living from that place. it just shows up when you need it. It just does.
Brilliant, thank you. So we have some time for questions. Yes. We have some time for questions, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. I don't know if we have microphones.
Also, if you can, please just ask a question rather than a comment. If you have comments, the authors will be downstairs after this session signing books and things, but we do have to wrap it up fairly quickly because of the contract, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, who has a question? Go ahead, Jamie.
I believe, Pedro, you were introduced as a producer for the film. This is not who we are.
No, I'm not a producer. I'm just in it.
Okay. My apologies. But in that film, one thing that hit me is that right here where we are right now, the Boulder Creek Greenway was the former African-American housing in Colorado, in Boulder. And so this greenway, where this library exists right now, used to be the African-American housing. And there was no housing left, no affordable housing, so it created a diversity collapse. This is a model for so many cities, is what's gone on in Boulder. My hometown of Chattanooga, Tennessee, copied the Boulder Creek Greenway system as a model for them, and it created gentrification that is also moving out African Americans from Chattanooga. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who created it, did the same thing in New York with Central Park. Central Park was all African American housing and used eminent domain to take that and create a park that's a rectangle that is the most visited park in the United States. Someone is always paying. Someone is always on the lower tier. And between the creation of those two parks, 30 million buffalo were killed for the leather industry at that time. Where do animal rights come into this equation in radical inclusivity? And how do we get to this place where radical inclusivity does not have something that's on a lower tier that has to pay the price for development?
Well, what I say to myself, thank you for your question. What I told myself a long time ago is I had to make peace with the fact that as a Black American, that's how I identified and that's how I grew up, despite my father's immigrant status, that I knew I was seen as the least. And I accepted it. I knew that I was seen as expendable, and I accepted it. And the way I answered that question was I one day came to this idea that all of creation took a vote and said it was okay for me to be here. It had already said yes to me. And so my job was to say yes to myself. And so that's how I live. I think that the challenge of people's consciousness right now is they don't define themselves as I am this. They say, and there's Ubuntu which says I am because you are, and then there's whatever the hell we got going on that says I am because you are not. And so we need to, one by one, work on our consciousness. This is my suggestion of saying yes to everything that shows up because it's here. Like going through like this shouldn't be that way and that shouldn't, just say yes, 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 and allow it to transform you, even the things that hurt you, even the things that break your heart. Say yes and then allow it to transform you. That's what I suggest to everyone and everything. And eventually you'll be doing it to our neighbor, our brother, our sister, and we won't be able to do it anymore.
I have an assignment for everyone. Pick an animal, an endangered creature, and do a saturation job, as Ed Sanders used to call it, after Charles Olson, but a saturation job where you really go into the life, the history. I took on the manatee in a book called Manatee, Humanity, and went to the museum in France with the skeletons and saw the manatee. And then I learned that the manatee was very close to the elephant in terms of mental capacity, and in the sort of a parade of the skeletons, they're right next to each other. Things like that were so mind-blowing. This idea of more gray matter in the brain than manatee has, and the habits of the manatee, a little like the dolphin, very playful, very interested in human, went and swam with manatee in Florida and tried to see manatee everywhere I could, and it was probably a 3 year investigation that continues. There's, organizations that protect the manatee. Jeb Bush had taken the manatee off the endangered list, so that was a trigger. And I'd been down in Miami at the book fair and wandered off to the aquarium and spent time with a very wounded ancient female manatee with, scars from monofilament line and blades of boats and so on. So that way that you can investigate another life form just for your own, furthering into that, and then, start a collective where you're all doing that and sharing it and publishing it. We honored manatee. There's a manatee day now that can be honored. Anyway, everybody get to work.
Probably have time for one more question at least. Yeah.
There's someone in that corner there.
Hold on. They have to be able to hear you.
So my question is, how do you find the courage to have an open discourse with somebody about radical inclusivity that is coming from a more narrow way of seeing the world, that their imaginative capacity is much more limited? How do you help broaden that to get past the singular identities and to kind of welcome everyone into a broader world, especially with our very polarized political world right now?
I use art, so I use painting, I use writing fiction, short stories, because I find that emotions can get to people, and especially, I use art, so I use painting, drawing, writing fiction, to get into the heart of the person, and that can then sort of influence their mind. So art is a good way to connect.
In my tradition, it's really important to plant seeds, and the world will water them. So I feel like I do what I can, whether I'm in the classroom or whether I come out into the community. It's important for us to plant seeds, and the community, the society, the world, is supposed to help with the cultivation and ultimately bring them to harvest and everything. But I think that's really a part of it. I believe self-motivation is very important, to do things daily, that we not simply practice self-care, but we also practice society care. And so that toggle between self-transformation and social transformation is real. In Kiswahili, they talk about the asili, so this generative seed that keeps regenerating over and over again. And I would like to think that that's human experience, right? That we have the ability to regenerate over and over again. Great question, thank you.
Share meals and experiences, invite somebody into your home. I think that's from an early age in New York, that in the neighborhood, down in the village, that would happen. You'd go into somebody's home, had a different background, had come from Hungary, escaping this or that, people who had been through all kinds of things, and you tried something you'd never tried before. So on that kind of level.
The last thing I throw out there is laughing, just laughing. Because anything that you can laugh at, that means you processed it. So do the work, healing on yourself, finding the comedy in some of those things. The formula for comedy is tragedy plus time, or disaster plus distance. And so if you can work inside of yourself to kind of minimize that, then the other person seems less of a threat to you. And if they seem like less of a threat to you, then they don't feel like you're a threat to them, and then you can laugh.
And also, just one sentence, don't think about what you can do what you can.
Okay, so we are at time, but I would invite you, if you have further questions for our audience, for our panelists, to come downstairs while they'll be signing books. And I personally feel inspired by this and ennobled by this, and feel like I have some great ideas for homework, and I hope you all do as well. So please join me in thanking our esteemed guests here today.